Hi guys, so as promised, I am doing a tutorial for you on how to make a bias cut skirt and how to make it a little bit easier. So this is the pattern that I'm using. You can use any pattern that says bias cut skirt, but it is McCall's 7931, and I've actually already traced out my blocks, as you can see, to use, and I have my fabric here. It's silk charmeuse. You can use a poly charmeuse. I love charmeuse for a bias cut skirt because it has a certain gloss to it that's really fun. You can use a print. That's fun. Just make sure that it's not a directional print because a bias cut skirt is cut on that diagonal, and if you have a directional print, it's going to look a little wonky. So this is usually the table that I cut things out on, but it's a little bit too small to do these bias pieces, so I'm gonna actually do it on the floor. So here I am on my studio floor. I have my old trusty cardboard, cutting that out, and as you can see I have one of my pieces laid out. A couple things that I want to tell you first before I start cutting. So one of them is that this pattern came with facing pieces, and I just completely eliminate those. So I only have a front piece, and then I'm going to cut out the back piece, 2 total pieces for this skirt. That's because I'm going to be putting elastic in instead of the traditional facing and zipper. So there's that. And then the other thing that I want to tell you is that a bias cut skirt is cut at a 45-degree angle. So that is why we have, so typically we have the grain line that runs up and down the skirt. That's just a typical skirt. But with the bias cut, we line up the bias line with the selvage edge. What that does is it creates, out of a woven that's not normally stretchy, it creates a stretch to it. So this woven doesn't stretch with the warp or the weft at all, but because it's at an angle, it will have a stretch. What that means is that this skirt is also going to hug your curves. Now because of that, my tip, my number 1 tip, I guess, you can write this down, number 1 tip, is to actually cut out the skirt 1 to 2 sizes bigger than you normally would cut out your skirt. So I've cut this skirt a full, or I will be cutting this skirt out a full size bigger than I normally go for. And that again is just because we have some stretch, we have some clinginess, and I don't really love the hug around my hips as much. So anyway, that's tip number 1. And then I will go ahead and cut this out, cut out my 2 pieces and go from there. Okay, so this kind of actually brings me to step number 2. Once you cut your skirt out, you do not want to mess with your blocks at all. You don't want to mess with your pieces. So, okay, so I have cut out my piece, and this leads me to the second tip that I have for you guys, is that you don't want to fiddle too much with it once you've cut it out. That's because we have this stretch in it now, and if you pull it or even pick it up, it's gonna warp the fabric or make it stretchy weird, and you just don't even want to mess with that at all. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly take out my pins and then just kind of gently roll this or kind of fold this up so that it's sitting and ready for me to do my 3rd step or 3rd tip for you, and that is how to do the side seams of the skirt so they also don't get warped or wonky at all. So like I said, I'll just kind of gently fold this up. I don't really want to pick it up or hang it. I'm just going to keep it like this, set it aside, and not fiddle with it until later. Okay, this is my favorite tip ever for a bias cut skirt. Well, maybe the elastic waist is a good contender. Anyway, I actually use this soft stretch heat and bond. It comes in a roll of tape, and you can even get it at Walmart or whatever big box fabric store you have locally. But I really like to use this too. So background, I've done a lot of leather work, and what made me think of this is that I glue a lot of my seams in leather working with the leather cement first before I stitch it. And so this is brilliant because it keeps your side seams from stretching out, which can lead to that wavy look that you just really don't want on your hips. So I will apply this to the right side. Here's my piece that I've just cut out. I believe this is my front piece. It doesn't matter. Just choose one of your skirt pieces. And again, we're not picking it up, stretching it around all funny. We're keeping it from doing that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the heat and bond with my iron to the glossy side or the right side of the fabric on both side seam edges. And I'm going to get pretty close to that edge without going over. I'm just going to run it down the entire length of the skirt. Like I said, I'm going to do this on both sides without, being too fiddly with my piece. And then once I do that, this stuff is so fun too because it just kind of instantly will bond to that. I'm going to rip it off here at the end. Let it cool just a little bit. And then you can take off the paper. What you have left, you can kind of see a little bit of a residue that it leaves behind, which is actually the tape that will bond together. Do that to one side and then to the other. Okay, now I'm grabbing my other piece, the back side of the skirt, and I'm actually going to fuse along the side seam because I have this tape ready to go. I'm going to fuse the two front and back sides together. So I'm going to line it up. And I'm still getting a little more fiddly than I should or probably would like, but you have to touch the fabric. But you just kind of run it along and fuse the two sides together. Here's what I like about it is that it keeps it from stretching. It gives it a little bit more body or stability along those side seams. Okay, both sides are fused together now. I'm a little bit more confident about picking it up because it's, like I said, it has more stability. It's not going to stretch out and go wonky. Now that it's fused together, I'm actually going to stitch it together. What's awesome about this is that you don't need a serger with a bias cut skirt because the sides are fused. I will just trim it. So I'll stitch it first, trim it, and just leave it at that. It's not going to fray, which is, the primary reason for serging. So the good news is to do a bias cut skirt is that you don't need like fancy special equipment. You can do this with your home machine. It'll turn out gorgeous. So I'm going to go ahead and take it to the machine now. Okay, so here's my tip number 4, but it only applies to silk. So if you're sewing on silk, The needle that you're using is so important because silk is actually a really sharp fiber and you need the sharpest needle that they have. So mine actually says Microtex, but if you have something that says silk, it's made specially for those silk fibers. If you start to have issues with snagging or any kind of pulling on the fabric, don't be afraid to change out your needle. It just means you have a dull needle, and they get dull really fast with silk. Now with a bias cut skirt, it's not as extensive as like doing a dress, so you should be okay, but have extra on hand just in case. Now again, that tip number 4 only applies to silk. But I will be sewing my side seams together now. I just need to make sure that I am completely encasing all of that tape. You don't want any glue or residue showing when you open up the seam on the right side of the skirt. So I'm going to go ahead and sew my side seams now, and then we will press them out. Pause for another tip. As you're sewing the side seams together, you want to make sure that you're not resisting or pulling in any way. You kind of just want to gently feed your fabric into your presser foot there, because if you start pulling as you're sewing, again, you're going to have that wavy side seam that you just don't want. So just make sure you're kind of gingerly touching the fabric. Okay, side seams have been sewn together, but actually before I press it, I am going to trim the side seams down to 1/4 inch because, like I said, the beauty of this is you don't have to use a fancy serger. So trimming it will keep it from fraying enough. Okay, I have trimmed the side seams down to 1/4 inch wide. And I've also pressed them out. Now when you're pressing, you, again, don't want to stretch it as you press it. Sometimes I have the tendency to just press and press and push and press. Just gently press along and, you know, make sure the seam is open. And lastly, while you're still on the ironing board, is that you want to flip it to the outside and just make sure, give it a quick inspection and make sure that none of that gooey tape is exposed, because again, you don't want to see that on the outside of your skirt. But we are ready for the next step, which is going to be so much fun. It's putting the elastic waist in. So here we go. So here I have my elastic. It's wide. I think this one's about 1.5 inches wide. As long as it's wide, it doesn't matter. You can do like 2-inch wide, but I just happen to have this on hand. And all I'm gonna do is throw it around my waist to where I feel like it's comfortable. Now this bias cut skirt goes up to the natural waist, so I am gonna put it all the way up here. And this is where I want it. I guess if you wanted it lower, you would have to cut the skirt a little bit lower and do it where you want it. But since the pattern goes up to the natural waist, that's what I'm doing. And again, I'm just kind of pulling it to where it's comfortable. I'm going to overlap it about 1/2 inch and then cut it right about there. I have my elastic now to the measurement I prefer, and so I'm just going to overlap it that 1/2 inch and zigzag that pretty well together to make an elastic band. So I threw a bunch of zigzags in there to really hold that together well. And now I'm just going to install it into my skirt. Okay, now we're ready to install the elastic into the skirt. This is tip number 5. Let's see, 5. And again, one of my favorite tips because it makes this so much easier than sewing in a zipper. So I'm going to take that zigzag seam that we just put into our elastic and pin it to one of the side seams of the skirt on the right side. So it doesn't matter which side seam you choose, just line it up and put a pin in it. And now you'll notice that the elastic is actually smaller than the waistband. So how are we going to get it in there evenly? Well, I like to use a method called quartering, which is kind of similar to a method that you're gonna use if you do like a t-shirt and put a neckband in. But what we do is we start with the side that we just pinned. We're gonna hold that and then fold this and find the middle by folding it. You're gonna then line that up with your other side seam. So here I have the halfway point. I'm gonna line that up with my side seam on the other end and put a pin in that. So now we have two, and we're gonna do the same thing with halfway between the side seams. So I am gonna match up my side seams. Again, fold the elastic to find the middle point. I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna put a pin in it because I have to do the same thing with the skirt piece. Again, try not to stretch it too much, but I'm gonna line up the side seams and find that halfway point. I'm going to line up the elastic with that and put a pin in it. Pin it all together. Okay, so now we have three, and I'm gonna do the same on this side, lining up the two side seams, finding the halfway point again, and the halfway point in that skirt piece. Line them up, pin them together, and it's called quartering because you have 4 pins that cut the whole waistband into quarters. It makes it easier to stretch the elastic piece to fit the waist. I'm going to stitch it together now, but you need to be aware as you're stitching it that yes, you will be stretching the elastic to fit the waistband, but you don't want to be stretching it any further than that point, meaning you don't want to stretch this fabric out too much with it. So be aware of stretching the top piece, but not past the point where you're starting to stretch the fabric underneath. I'm gonna go ahead and sew it with a regular seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch all the way around the waistband. I'm gonna use a zigzag, but a small zigzag stitch. So meaning that the stitch length will be the same, but I'm gonna make it a little bit more narrow. That's the kind of stitch that you use with any stretchy fabrics. And because we are doing stretchy elastic and the fabric is also on the bias and a little bit stretchy, it's gonna be a benefit to when you stretch that waistband to put on. So I will go ahead, narrow my zigzag stitch and put it in. Again, I'm stretching this quarter of my waistband. I'm stretching the elastic to fit the fabric underneath as I stitch with that narrow zigzag. Okay, I did leave my pins in as I sewed. Normally I take them out, but I guess I left them in because it helps. It helps to kind of keep track of where you're at, keep it all held together as you're kind of stretching and sewing. But go ahead and remove the pins, and then you're gonna roll the elastic then to the inside of your skirt. Did you see how I did that? So here it is with right sides together, and then I'm gonna open it up and then roll it to the inside. And there you have your elastic waistband. I'm next gonna actually press it out just to kind of give it a clean edge. And then to tack it down, I'm gonna stitch in the ditch and just do a little straight stitch right here along the waistband on either side. So both side seams to tack it down. So I just wanted to show you the inside of the waistband. It's in and I've pressed it. So That's what it looks like on the inside. So you know you're on the right track if it looks like that. And it just stretches right on, right over your hips, and it's so much easier. We're now ready to hem it, but the best tip that I've ever taken from somebody else is that you need to hang your bias cut skirt overnight. And that's because of the bias, it kind of settles in. The hem on the bottom can tend to be a little bit uneven. So you want to give it a chance to hang and settle into itself. Then you're going to even out the hem and hem it. So I am actually going to hang this overnight, and I'm going to pick up another skirt that I made the other day and didn't hem for the same reason. I just wanted to let it hang overnight and sit overnight and settle into itself. You can either hang it on a dress form if you have one, or I actually use a hanger and just like a trouser hanger, pin it up there and let it hang. So I will be hemming this skirt, and I want to explain also that I normally have a presser foot that does a beautiful rolled edged hem. I am not going to use that presser foot, not only because I'm avoiding, the fancy expensive equipment that, the salesman will try to get you to buy, but also because it's actually just a better way to do a bias edge hem. No, I'm saying that wrong. A bias hem that won't give you like a rippled edge effect. And again, that's just because of the stretch that you're working with. You sometimes want that ruffly lettuce edge, but not with this skirt. So I'm going to show you how to do that just with a regular old presser foot. Okay, so I'm going to be stitching around the hem of the skirt actually 3 times. The first time is kind of like, because we're working with, again, the stretch, it's kind of like stay stitching. So I'm going to do that regular stitch length, about 3 or 3.5, around the entire hem at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Okay, there you have it. I have stitched all the way around 1/4 inch away from the edge, and it's like stay stitching, which just means it's going to kind of hold it and keep it in place from stretching out. So my next time around, I'm actually going to fold along that stitch line, and then I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from that line, or fold. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now too. And this process is a little bit lengthy, but it's really worth the effort, because in the end you're going to have a really nice rolled hem, again, that you don't need fancy equipment for, and it's going to look a little crisper on the bottom of that bias cut skirt. So I'm going to go ahead again and stitch 1/8 of an inch away from that fold that I'm folding along the stitching I just did. Okay, so there's my second stitching line around the hem. Now I'm going to take this over to my work table, and I am going to trim almost all the way down to this second stitching line. I just want to trim away this excess fabric here on the inside of the hem. I will go and do that, and then we're going to put in our final stitch around the edge. Okay, you can see I trimmed this super close to that second line of stitching, because next we're actually going to roll it or fold it and stitch that down. It's kind of hard to tell, but it's just going to be like this narrow little fold. So I will go ahead and do that. So there I've finished my third stitch around the entire hem, and that third stitching line is really the only one that you're going to see on the outside of the skirt. And before I go ahead and press it out, I just want to show you how clean that edge winds up being. See, we don't have much ruffle going on, and it's even going to be better once I press it. But I just wanted to show you that really I love some nice equipment. I love my little rolled edge presser foot, but it's just super not necessary with a bias cut skirt if you do these steps. And again, they're kind of lengthy, kind of tedious, especially the cutting, which I didn't even show you guys, but it's really worthwhile in the end. So I'm gonna go ahead and press this out and it'll be done. So here is the bias cut skirt. I went and tried it on for you, and hopefully with my 6 tips, I have inspired you or helped to make this an easier process. Thank you so much for tuning in.